Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on the body. As per usual, this lecture will be split into parts which you can follow in the playlist. So for a general overview, we're looking today at the body and focusing on the idea of that the subject, which is the body, as an object. So how can the subject be an object? And following on from previous lectures where we have seen photographs of the body, we see these photographs everywhere, such as vernacular, documentary. We're going to be looking at it from a different perspective this time and focusing on mostly staged and constructed photographs. So we're going to touch on ideas of the gaze, identity, gender and performance, and the abject. It's a very large topic, so we're not going to cover every single thing about the body. For example, we haven't had enough time to touch on technology or the body as a machine. And then in next week's lecture on representation, some of these ideas will be followed on, focusing on the body, representation, and race and the Western gaze. So today we're looking at the gaze and this idea of objectification, fetishism, and voyeurism in the photograph and how the photograph plays a role in this regard. So what I've got here for you is a Victorian erotic image. It was very hard to find a soft version of this. Beware. This lecture will have a bit of nudity as well as sort of bodily matters towards the end, but I will give you a heads up. So with the accessibility of the camera and the photographs, as you can see here in the 1900s with the daguerreotypes, pornography and erotica was made accessible through the ease of photography. So with photography came pornography. So there is actually an extensive amount of Victorian pornography out there. Very intense. So here is the softcore version. So with this idea of photography and the photograph, we've talked about the photograph as an object. So if the photograph is an object, how does this work in terms of the subject and what role or what power does the subject have? And so power is something really very much to think about when we are talking about the gaze. So in the 1970s, 1980s, feminists were criticizing advertising and the publicity images that were eroticizing the female body in a way that, as mentioned by, discussed by Michelle Henning in this essay, The Subject as Object, Photography in the Human Body, in Liz Wells' Photography Critical Introduction, which I've included a link for the online copy of it if you want to read it at the end of the lectures. She describes how they were talking about how women were being made into mere objects for a male gaze, and then how sort of this is what objectification is. So the term objectification is this sort of thing about how women were being made into objects for this male gaze. So she's just explained it here in really nice, simple terms. Human beings were being perceived and represented as objects. So we'll sort of tease out how and what that means as well. And theorist, critic Abigail Solomon-Gaudu, a historian as well, explains in her essay Reconsidering Erotic Photography Notes for a Project of Historical Salvage that the concept of objectification is extremely relevant to photography. She says that, in one sense, photography inadvertently objectifies people by turning them into things to be looked at. So around here, the conversations about fetishizing commodities, so photographs of people, becoming this commodity that's connected to capitalist economy. And feminists in the 1980s, 1970s were criticizing this and responding to this in terms of artists making work. And there was a lot of discussions and critical thoughts and discussions around this as well at the time, with the feminist movement of this era and postmodernism. So the male gaze was a term coined by film theorist Laura Mulvey in her 1975 essay Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, and it explains how the female figure on screen is potentially troubling to the male heterosexual viewer. So she says here that the woman is icon displayed for the gaze and enjoyment of men. The active controllers of the look always threaten to evoke the anxiety it originally signified. So a lot of this discussion of fetishism is referring back to Freud's definition. So I do recommend having a look into it if you're unsure what that means. But there's this whole sort of thing about anxiety of this thing that you don't understand, this desire and derision. So in this instance, women in these descriptions are both passive as well as being these objects of desire. So we can see these sort of discussions about commodity and women as objects explored by Barbara Kirk here, who you might have seen, especially in terms of her influence as a postmodern artist and feminist artist, examining stereotypes and behaviours of consumerism, layering text over mass media images. And here, your body is a battleground. She's sort of like talking, I guess, about sort of this political issue of women's bodies, she uses collage and photo montage. So collage using the model's face from a poster, sort of dividing it to sort of give this meaning and critiquing it, like sort of the idea that beauty and what we're subjected to should be symmetrical. She's sort of done some very simple design to communicate that. And so the original design from the poster was from a massive pro-choice rally around this time in Washington. So she's sort of using these images to sort of take it back and take control back of the conversation. So a real key person in terms of discussions, early discussions about the gaze and this gaze upon women, by men, is John Berger in Ways of Seeing, which I've also put a couple of links at the end of the lecture for you to follow up on. And Ways of Seeing was a BBC series where he looks at art, historical art and photography, and sort of analyzes how this gaze is working and how women are internalizing this gaze back onto themselves. So he says here that men look at women watch themselves being looked at. This determines not only most relations between men and women, but also the relation of women to themselves. The surveyor of woman in herself is male, the surveyed female. Thus she turns herself into an object, and most particularly an object of vision, a sight. So he's talking about how that women are already constituted as objects to be looked at by men who are possessing this gaze, and then women are internalizing this gaze back on themselves. And I mentioned the critic Solomon Gaudu earlier, and her opinion here is that women are already objectified by the male gaze. The photograph, what it's doing, because the photograph is the object itself, it's doubly objectifying women. So there's this double up of objectification that is going on when women are being photographed. So my question is, for you to think about, is how do photographs, in particular advertising, play this role in stereotyping representations of women? And, how much has changed since these discussions were happening in the 70s, in the early 90s, in the 80s, and now. So we'll look at some artists who were looking at these same issues around a similar time. And this is a British photographer, writer and cultural worker, Jo Spence. And what she did here, so you can see she's responding to the sort of conversations about what a woman is expected to do of the time. And so here she's done these playful portraits looking at women's place within the market economy. So it's this remodeling photo history series, and she's sort of using parodizing advertising imagery and shifting it, what we expect and the conventions of it, to criticize the way that women are objectified as homemakers, cleaners, and objects of sexual pleasure. So you wouldn't look at these images and think of them necessarily in that way. So, she's using artifice, staging, and role play here, and, presenting herself as a domestic worker, laughing as she reads Freud's writing, or holding the, bottle of dishwashing liquid, like in a way that someone, advertising the product would, but it's not what you would expect from a traditional idea of advertising. And if we think now about, it's not the colours, the framing, everything. It's very against what we expect from these images and these advertising. So Berger here, again in Ways of Seeing, explains that, but the essential way of seeing women, the essential use to which their images are put, has not changed. Women are depicted in quite a different way from men, not because the feminine is different from the masculine, but because the ideal spectator is always assumed to be male, and the image of women is designed to flatter him. So when he's talking about has not changed, he's talking about paintings in the art historical canon, and looking at modern times in the 70s, how this hasn't shifted. And I want you to think about that now. Has that shifted? And Burgess suggests in Ways of Seeing, a way to think about this is that think of a painting or an image that depicts a representation of a woman. Now try and reimagine it, and that woman is a man, but keep everything the same pose, the same angle, the same lighting, the same framing, and think about whether that sits right or not, and sort of how we're trained to think and how we're trained to see images and digest and process images. So Polish artist Katarzyna Koźra, again, my pronunciation is all over the place, but she produced this video work called Man's Bathhouse. So she's a Polish artist, and what she did was she went into a men's bathhouse, and she had a fake penis attached to her and a towel hung over her shoulders, covering her breasts, and basically set up this camera without permission, videoing men using the bathhouse. I guess putting the gaze on men in this instance. And she was doing this to sort of discover how men act when they're alone and what they do, sort of, how do they perceive their bodies or how do they look at each other. And her sort of surprise was that even when men are alone, they still focus on their appearance, looking at each other, comparing each other. So before she produced this work, I've got the date wrong, it should be 1999, apologies. She produced a work in 1997 called Bathhouse, and what she wanted to do was show how women appear when nobody's looking and they don't need to follow these expectations of beauty canons. So she put this video camera in a woman's bathhouse, and she presented the female body as it was and encouraged the viewers to go against previous ideas and standards of beauty. So women of all ages sort of just, using this bathhouse without sort of pandering to, thinking that someone's watching them and viewing them. So it's interesting to think about those works in relation to what Berger was saying about this idea of being looked at and the spectator. But, obviously this work throws up a lot of other questions about consent and many other things that I feel like, and even had criticism then. But in terms of what discussions of the gaze, there are some interesting things to think about in that context. And she's also produced other work. So this work here was her exploring her battle with cancer and the taboo of naked models on display. So she produced 3 different works, sort of looking at this, the ailing body and the stereotypes against the Asian female body, sort of creating this, I guess, appropriation of, or sort of reimagining of Edouard Manet's Olympia. One of them with, it's sort of the black servant still in it here with the, the aging nurse. And then this other one where she's sort of, she's sort of sagging and old and naked, alone in bed. Well, a vision of herself as that. So sort of questioning, I guess, that the female nude in terms of illness, life and death, and the female body, not just a thing of beauty and admiration of the gaze, but these other things to think about in terms of just that cycle and this idea of aging and illness. So we've looked at the gaze in a general sense, and I think all the works we're looking at here sort of connect back to these ideas. Sort of, there is a lot of crossovers and intersections, so I think that's something to think about as well as we move on. So I'm just gonna pause it here, and we'll move on to part 2 in a moment, which will be focused on identity.